I'm really happy that we're going to have this chance to have a conversation. And yeah, we've been having conversations for some years now, and that's been really interesting. And I'm very happy also that we can continue here in Sao Paulo. So yeah, this is a new possibility.
Just opening up, it's your first exhibition in São Paulo, and maybe as a way of introducing your practice to the people who haven't had the chance to see it yet in person, I would say that what strikes me the most is this kind of particular ability that you have in threading through all these different means of making work and all of these different means of being in relation to things and to people and to the world. So the practice, I mean, I'm not even going to try to describe it as a whole. It spans 40 years, so it would be kind of madness. And there's painting, there's sculpture, there's installation, obviously film, audio, writing, and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's kind of how I would try to make a minimal description, you know, like this aspect of relation seems to be very important. Maybe we could start with that, if you want to address contact, negotiations in the contact zone, contact, the show itself. So maybe...
Okay, yeah, those are good places to start, I think, especially with this exhibition. And we can talk about some of the works that even have the same names, like Relations, for example. But yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about it like these certain recurring, you call them compulsions, or interests. And I was actually making a drawing today, try to think about them more. I'm doing this all the time anyway. But I'm just thinking about relations, and then also just the kind of connection also to reading, and so I think that we talked about another time even a book, Poetics of Relation, by Edouard Glissant, for example. But yeah, it's just a recurring theme. That does have to do with a lot of different forms of relation that I've been probing and contemplating over many years. And I guess it's also, I mean, in terms of the most basic kinds of relations, I've been thinking about the way families are related, or the people that you're supposedly related to, and but also the kinds of relations that emerge from your connections to certain forms like music or an art, and the kinds of figures that might be associated with those, and then you develop your own form of relation. I've sort of been thinking about a lot of different levels of it. So from a personal to public kinds of relations, and what each of those generate in different ways. And so, I mean, the work here, for example, that's called Relations, is a combination of different things. Again, it kind of came out of reading. So I was reading a book called Tropical Truth by Caetano Veloso, English version. And I was very struck by the way he described his relation to music and to also different kinds of musics. And I like to think of the Americas in a broad sense. And that's something I'm always coming back to. And and I can talk about that, the why that is, maybe a little bit later. But in this book, I really liked the list of different musicians that were kind of emerging, and also what was the starting point for Caetano in terms of what attracted him to music. And I really liked that it wasn't Elvis Presley, for example. It was more like James Brown or something like that. I mean, I actually haven't read the book for a long time, but I was really affected by it, and I read the whole thing, and then I was reading the index, and this is something we can also talk about, but I like to read the indexes and to go back and forth between like what's listed in the index and also what do I find in the book. But and so this work, I wanted to think about how those different names of musicians and things, like which ones I was familiar with, and then I could listen to more, and then also intertwine it with what I had grown up with sounds and things. So that would be from being born, like, so the beginning of the 1960s through the 70s, through the 80s, and thinking about these kinds of relations, because there's something that with music and sound, it's always coming back. And it's also something that's also inside of you, in a way. And so, yeah, it was, and so that's there. That's here in the show. And then we were talking about it the other day. Part of that work also has, there's a visual part that you see in the space. And there's another part that's very small that you see if you sit down and you look at the iPod. And there's a film on it, and it's called Megahertz, Megastar Brother, Brazil.
So, one of my favorite titles ever in the history of art.
And so that's super relations related.
Maybe to go back to what you mentioned about relation being in kind of direct intertwinement with reading. Would you mind if I read something that you wrote on this book on Inevitable Distances?
I'm totally curious what you...
It's right at the opening of the book, and it's something that has stayed with me for a little while. And it's this text that flows throughout the book, and it's called As I Read.
Okay.
And you begin it by saying, as I read between words, titles, names, chapters, lacunae, absence, and presence, I found/find myself then/now attracted to these words, designated as fictions. And I think this is a really incredible summary of what seems to be at the basis of all of your practice, no matter how it kind of unfolds into different kind of material realities, but as this kind of discursive conceptual practice of reading the world and to some degree collecting bits of it and reimagining, reinterpreting, creating relation, not only living relation. And I think that kind of flows into what you're saying about the work relation. And maybe before we get into Megahertz, Megastar Brother, Brazil again, we could use this work relation to talk about how Brazil itself comes into play a lot of the time in your work, and specifically in this exhibition.
Sure.
I imagine that people who have not come into contact with your work so far could come into the show and imagine that you made many works specifically to be here, but in reality this is like the different ways in which you relate to Brazil have come in and out of your work for 30 years or so. So it could seem surprising, and I would like you to talk a little bit more about that, this kind of how that also flows into another very important part of your practice, which is thinking about information exchange, thinking about import-export, thinking about familiarity and foreignness and displacement, all of these things as applied to yourself and as applied to bodies in general, but mostly as applied to culture, how culture circulates.
Okay, I like all of that. Where to begin? Yeah, I mean, I like very much the choice that you read about reading and also fiction, because the fiction is really important. And I've been thinking about it a lot because often people imagine what's made sometimes by others to be something. I mean, in some cases, people want that it's like a kind of truth, like autobiographical something, or you're trying to tell people about something, or this is the way it is, or whatever. But that's something I'm really not that interested in. I like very much the fictional dimension, where there are so many possibilities for what could be configured, and that you don't know what it is until you find it. And then it's like, okay, let me put that together. Let me put that in relation with this other thing. Or that you could, I mean, with relations, I like the capaciousness of what can be possible. And I think that sometimes may be almost the opposite of what might be imagined with what could be in relation, because it might be thought of as like, okay, that's like a family, and that's supposed to be related by blood or something like that. But I like the idea of each person has a way of perceiving, being alive, and the ways in which that might unfold are very variable and various, and so there's so many varieties of like what could be imagined together or in conjunction, and that's related to the, I guess, a kind of recurring core of what I do, and I can't say why that is. I don't know. It's just like the way it is for me. I like the combinations, and then I think that also thinking of oneself as being very much a combination of something is also an important aspect. And again, I would say that there's a lot of things that involve not knowing with that, but it's a kind of maybe like revelations that happen over time within the process of engaging and enacting something, like reading, for example, or maybe drawing and reading. Those are things I think about together. And I think that when there's the description of like something like conceptual, for example, or when there's a label like, oh, conceptual artist, that can be very misleading, depending on what anybody actually thinks of that as a definition. And so that's one of those things that I'm always raising questions about in terms of, well, what's the definition of whatever, it is. But I think like relations also is connected very much to language as well, to etymology, to thinking about what are the sources of different kinds of materials as well as words, how do they circulate, what's been, I mean, especially if you think of like very, very, very long histories and old places and languages, and this is kind of exceeding even European languages, for example. And so thinking of thousands and thousands of years of symbol making and what kinds of marks appear in different places in the world. What's the beginning of language, and marks that are made in drawings.
And maybe something about that in relation to fiction and in relation to this kind of label of conceptual art that you were mentioning. I think one of the things that I'm interested in your work and that I feel like influences me, if I can say that, is this kind of tendency towards reading also being misreading, and this kind of commitment to imprecision and to ambiguity and to opacity, even if we want to go back to this notion of relation coming from Glissant. And that sounds, for me, a very rich way of approaching fiction as well. And fiction making through living, let's say.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about it a lot. Like, I'm thinking about also sort of actually trying for myself to even reframe Glissant, even though I'm still learning about Glissant, but I'm also looking at, like, what's the time frame of when things are made. And so I'm thinking very much about, as an artist, what have I been making during a particular span of time. And so then I realized, because I came to Glissant, because it's in translation into English later than it appeared in France, for example. So that would have been like around 1990. That was when he was originally published in French, I think. I mean, this particular book we're talking about, Poetic of Relations. In English, it was 1997. So then I think, oh, okay, by 1997, what was I doing? What was I doing in 1990? What was I doing throughout the 1980s? And what kinds of things were stimulating? And how did fiction have a role, as well as language? Yet, what is it, like when you're making something that's visual, audio, or you're making maybe a film, or you're making an artwork, how is that kind of relationship created? Is it something that's obvious? Is it something that's more subterranean? And I mean, the ambiguity aspect is really, I like that part. Because with something that's a fiction, there is a specificity. There are things that are specifically structured or composed, but at the same time, there's another kind of openness for interpretation. Similarly with a poem, there's like specific language. It's the person who wrote it has an intention and puts the words together in a way that they're thinking about, and they're thinking about the relations. But once other people come into contact with it, it becomes a whole other thing. And there might be parts that are things that are resonating with what the intention was. And then there are other things that maybe are completely different that the person who made it never thought about. But I'm interested in that as well, and so, I'm actually sort of like experiencing it with this exhibition, even as it's like being completed, being installed, getting feedback from different people about different aspects that are striking to them. And then I can look at that in another way.
So as you were saying this, I was thinking about how when Fred Moten was here a few months ago, and also someone who is in this network of collaborators, of people who are in contact in the book, in the facing book, of course, and he said something really beautiful at he just had like a talk, a lecture that I was in, and he said something to the effect of, what if both politics and poetry are nothing but prepositional obsessions. So everything is really about how you choose to define very specific and pointed objects in language. And you're obsessed about if you say something is on something or at something. And that is like what drives the poet. But at the same time, the poet always wants the reader to look at what they've said without knowing exactly what has been said.
Right.
So that creates all of these different spaces for connection and for contact and for dispute to some degree, which I guess is what interests Fred in talking about like this individuation, the things that they're concerned about now. But I think to the point of fiction, I wonder if it's kind of along the same lines, you know. It's an obsessive trait of formalization of everything that you come to be in contact with. And all of these, as you said in the little extract that I read, words and people and you know, all of these little bits and pieces of influence, of reference that come into play from your reading to then be read again, you know, like this kind of filtering process.
Okay. So in terms of all of that, one of the things I wanted to just mention is from the title of this exhibition, which is the concept of the percept. Because the percept is a way of being able, and I'll describe what I mean by it a little bit more, but I'm thinking, I was sort of sparked by what you were saying about what Fred was saying, and about being a poet and with language. And I just want to clarify something a little bit more for me as an artist who's also writing, and I'm you know, sensitive to language, as I've been mentioning, and also the symbol making aspect, which I connect also with drawing. And so this idea of a percept is something it's different than perception. It's an idea, I'm thinking about Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari in their book called What is Philosophy? And in terms of art, that's the thing that I'm super interested in, how art is being defined or described as something that involves three different points, which are the percept, the affect, and the concept. And so these three are ways of thinking about art that they're describing, which I really found helpful, because the percept is something that exists beyond the artist. This is whatever is made. And what I was imagining in terms of the exhibition is that what I'm going to have here, or what I have here, are going to be things people are going to encounter in different ways. They're not equivalent with me necessarily. There are things that were made at different moments in different places. And I mean, maybe this relates back to what you were saying earlier in terms of imagining, you know, what anybody might imagine about what's in the exhibition. The percept is not the perception, it's whatever is made. And what's made is existing on its own to be encountered. And so I'm not really, I mean, when I was thinking about the exhibition, I was thinking about placing things in this house and how those things might be placed and all of that. And the kinds of ways there could be relationship. I didn't have a worked out completely because it needed to be experienced in space with the things. And so now that the exhibition is installed, it has a whole other different resonance for how I can feel it. So yeah, so this idea of coming closer, it's also related to the name of one of the works that's in the exhibition. And yeah, I'm just curious about what kinds of reactions come, and yeah, I don't really know.
So, talking about come closer to the work, I think it's a good work to come back to the question of like these particular connections to context and to this context, and it's a work in which you're articulating these different modes of distance and proximity to people and to locations, geographies, mental geographies sometimes. And one of these like particularly pointed locations is Brazil through two figures, Karim and your brother Derek. And Derek is a figure, I guess, which is an overarching presence in the exhibition.
Yes, it turned out that way. It wasn't something that I was intending necessarily, but in terms of my selection of different parts that I wanted to have in the whole house, that's how, yeah, it has kind of emerged that way. And so, yeah, his voice is a pretty recognizable and strong presence.
Yeah. And I think this kind of connects to things that I wanted to talk about this particular installation of the works. And I've seen a lot of these works in different locations. One thing that was quite striking for me was the way in which the house manifested another layer to a lot of the works, and how much of it is playing off this this concept of domesticity to some degree. And to link with what you were mentioning before, family as this kind of symbol for relation, and the house obviously have an atavic connection to each other. Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about this, like shared history, shared memory, presence and absence, and how you hear your brother's voice throughout this kind of domestic space. Talking about a house, actually, like the Schindler House and the Schindler Manifesto.
Yes.
Also, other works that have relation to this idea of living in space that you have done in the past, like the one that you conducted at the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille.
No, in Firminy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
In the Le Corbusier space.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that it's a combination of thinking about inhabitations and architecture, and like it's funny. Like for me, I don't really think about it as domesticity so much. I think maybe for me, I think about it in terms of like architectural structures that are houses, or architectural structures that are like the Unité Habitation in Firminy, like places where inhabitation is meant to take place, to live, like a place to live, but that's like a structure. And so this also, as a kind of modernist house, is something that is also goes along those lines of like almost kind of like an ideal structure for living, this kind of idea. And so, like in the Schindler House, also like the first modernist house in the United States, and the ideal of what could it be like to live in a place in a very beautiful way, and what that might entail. And so, the intersections between that and the inhabitants and the families or the relations, that's something that's kind of at play here also, and the garden as well. So the whole combination of this space that's imagined to be very inhabitable. And so with the Schindler statements and manifesto, the space architecture, they're kind of depicting an ideal of also nature being tamed by this structure that's situated in space. Yet, what happens inside is something that can be very surprising. And I think that the ways that these domestic components, like furniture and things like that, wallpaper and all of those, like them carrying this other layer of what could be considered. And so I use that in the house, in the spaces. But I mean, I think it's interesting what you mentioned about it. You've seen these works in other situations, and so I think that what happens is that they also change when they're brought into a house. So if you've seen them in a museum or another kind of space, it would be different. But I think the fact that everything is brought together within this house, and when the way that you move through the house, the way rooms are in this house and things like that, it creates a completely other way of experiencing them, and which has been really interesting to explore.
Yeah, and to see as well, I can say. Yeah, I mean, I think a particular example of this in this context is the library, in which all of these kind of subjects about reading and perception and reference and influence kind of get coalesced or condensed into a space which is made for living. And the way in which this plays into the show, I think, turned out really interestingly. And maybe if you would like to talk a little bit more about the new space poem, which is sitting at the library, I think that could be really nice.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. I'm happy about the library. Happy to be able to have made something within the library, and so the space poem. There are two of them, one in English and one in Portuguese, that go around the perimeter of where the railing is in the library. And so, yeah, this idea of kind of a combination of things that I wanted to bring in. One was thinking about the geography and the equator and movement of the equator even. And so in this poem, I wanted to think about both geology, geography. I was reading a book by John McPhee that was going into like geological movements through durations of time. And also I was very interested to bring back Borges in relation to the library, this idea of like the world library, and the kind of multiplicity of what might be contained in such a thing. And so that's also kind of woven into this poem. And yeah, that's but in the library is also the other aspect. There's a kind of stage in the library, and I mean that was part of the library with a skylight, and in that area is the toile, the commemorative toile. This work that I had made I started making in 1991. And so Yeah, so that's here as well, in conjunction with the new space poems.
And I wanted to ask you about that work in particular. I was very, I was really interested in the fact that the work since 1991 has had all of these different iterations, and it's been applied, let's say, to different furniture.
Yes.
And here it's been added to Brazilian modernist furniture, which goes with the context of the house, but obviously has some kind of underlining subtext connecting to the work itself and how the work approaches these different geographic histories of displacement and violence. But I was wondering if you can talk more about this decision of not bringing furniture that was already upholstered with the work, but making a new version specifically.
Okay, sure, yeah. Well, as you mentioned, I've reiterated it. What stays the same is the wallpaper and the textile. They're the same as what I was making in 91 to 92. I produced it with the Fabric Workshop in Philadelphia. But it's been applied to different surfaces, also like furniture, as well as a suit was made from the fabric. And so each of the situations in which I've presented it have been very specific. And I like to alter the way that the fabric and the textile fabric and the wallpaper might be used in the different places. And so here I was curious about what would it look like as the surface of modernist Brazilian furniture. And so we looked at different kinds of furniture and chose these works, these pieces in the end. And yeah, I think that the way that they exist, though, is something that it's kind of a combination of things that are like a disjuncture. And that's intentional, that it's something that maybe on the surface when you first see it or something, it might seem like something very recognizable, but then when you get closer, you come closer, you see something else. And then also, it looks, if you're thinking about modernist furniture, why would it have a floral pattern on it of that kind? It's something like 18th century kind of toile de jouy. Why? And so I like this disjuncture. I like something that's not fitting exactly, and that's always somehow a bit skewed. So that you can look at it in a different way. So that's part of what I was thinking about.
This idea of reiteration, I feel like it's an emerging theme in a lot of the works. Begin again, begin again. I think is the most clear maybe proposition of that. But here, where we are, we can see the one that goes after the quarrel at the. Sorry, I'm gonna.
You can say it in Portuguese.
After the quarrel in the house, after the revolution, after the crisis. So there's this kind of reiterative quality to it as well. And or even in the work that welcomes is in the house, begin again. There's also this quality of the years, 1991, 1992, 1993. So that seems to be kind of this interest as well, that is manifested somehow across the works.
Yes, I mean, I think it can be, you can think about it also just with another day also. It's sort of, another year, another day, the certain kind of repetition that exists in being alive, yet each day is different. And so with the afters also, everything's always going to be after something else. But in this case, with the space poem that's in this room, after I was really, I was mentioning to you before, I think, different kinds of relations. And so in this case, the poet Muriel Rukeyser, I was very interested in Muriel Rukeyser's poetry. And I'm also interested in indexes and the first sentences, first lines in poems. And so I had realized that Muriel Rukeyser had written many poems that all began in the first line with after. And so I used all of the afters I found in her poetry of first lines and made this poem out of those and added like a twist, which was like begin again, begin again. And so it's like there's a certain kind of, recursiveness in living. And so, but then there's also like variations, moment by moment. But, and so I think about the things in this way. It's sort of how are the things going on? How are things beginning again? How could it be, how might it be different? So these are also sort of like repeating questions from me. But yeah.
I wanted to go back now to because I cut you off when you were talking about megahertz, megastar.
Okay, yeah.
This is a point where we can come
okay.
talking about, well, I have a few things
sure.
Still to ask, but,
okay.
But maybe let's talk about this for a little bit.
Okay, I'm curious about your questions.
Well, I guess the question is, again, going back to the idea of relation and the word relation, which kind of sits across from that. Like how, how you're addressing, again, familiarity and foreignness, distance and proximity in both of these works in a way that are obviously in conversation but seem very different.
Okay, I mean, I think that maybe, this kind of, this distance and relation, they're pretty connected. And they're not something that, I'm not necessarily so consciously thinking about it, but then I realize it maybe after I've made something or I've been doing whatever. And so also, I mean, they do have a personal aspect, like a relationship. And so, and that makes them, in a way, almost kind of basic, which is that, just sort of missing someone, missing people, or wishing you had a different kind of, had less distance, you could come closer. And so in the case of that film, it's from 2008, and I was thinking about both my brother Derek and also my friend Kareem, and that's what's stated in the film. And they both were in Brazil at that time, and so just kind of reflecting on them and imagining what they were going through, as well as the fact that I also was, I think I was in Vienna at some point or somewhere. We've always been like in these various places, often not in the same place. Sometimes we meet somewhere for like some moments, like it's said in the film, and then we continue doing whatever we're doing. And so that's kind of the case, I would say, with many people that I know, like maybe the majority, that, even though you might be friends with whomever, or, related, or, but it's not as if you're really physically in the same place, but you're still connected in some kind of way. So it's a kind of longing, expressing a longing, but also a way things exist, and the inevitable distances. And I mean, the inevitable distance is also, we are inevitably different. we're each in our own bodies, you know. I mean, that's already a big difference. So yeah, so these things are like, they come, I always back and forth, I would say, in what I make. And I mean, this idea of contact also is another one. But it's another aspect, to be able to come into contact, the challenge of being able to come into contact. When you do come into contact, what is that? And so it's not as if any of these things are like so clear, but they may be aspirational, you know, in certain ways, and then maybe they're delusionary as well as elusive. So it's like, so it's a kind of like the continual, the ongoing becomingness of you know, being alive, really.
Yeah, I was going to say that also brings us back to this idea of reiteration in the sense of ongoingness, and like this kind of unending attempt to be in contact, which is kind of challenged by living itself to some degree. And this also reminds me of what I guess is my favorite banner from all the space poems, which is the one that says ongoing stuff. And I think this is kind of like a very good kind of frame to look at your work in general. Like, I think it's from the first
from the space poem number 1, yeah.
So it just kind of like gives a key into looking towards what you've done since then. Like, it's just ongoing stuff.
Ongoing stuff.
This accretion, you know, like a preoccupation with selecting and caring for specific bits of what kind of never stops.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, yeah.
And maybe something that is more like less visible in the show, but that we've mentioned in the conversation a couple of times, and that you know is a topic of interest we share, the indexes. I'm really constantly thinking about your work, selected life indexes, and it seems like the form that they take kind of reappears here and there in the show as well. These lists of names, these lists of years, with this again an ambiguity that is undergirding it.
Yeah.
But also this relationship to the span of time in which things happen that you mentioned before. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, about like the qualities of indexing that are kind of maybe less apparent in these works, but quite relevant.
Okay, I can talk about it. I mean, I think actually, I mean, when I think about index, I think about it also as a trace, and also in relationship to photography, and so and light, and that it's also, it's something that makes what's called an indexical mark. That's what a photograph is, or what's on film, and now digitally made. And so it's the combination of these things. They're all in this exhibition in a way. A print is also kind of like an indexical marking. Prints are in the show. The lists also of the years, and sort of marking. I mean, I'm not going to describe it because I want people to see it. But and then there are these films and videos in the show, and someone who was looking at one of them was saying, "Wow, it's like a time capsule with the megahertz megastar brother Brazil," and so. Yeah, I think that, I mean, this idea of the index is a really interesting one. The selected life indexes was like trying to think about an entire life and how would there be an index of it? Like what, if you were to choose different figures, I chose Muriel Rukeyser was one, and W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Albert Einstein, they were others. and thinking about, well, what would be the distillation of an entire life? How would you read it? How would you encounter it? What would be portable? What's like an index, as the selected life indexes, the idea was almost like having a portable memorial. But the memorial, it would require the people to be gone to have it. But it was like a way to like reactivate a relation to them. So yeah, there's so much with the idea of an index, but I think there's a certain kind of sensibility that's attracted maybe to going into that mode, and that even enjoys reading them. So I don't know. I mean, I'm still. It's a kind of open question that I have about that. But there are other instances of artists who've been engaged with that, art and language, for example. But I wanted to take it into like a material dimension as well. So, yeah.
And then you're somehow in the middle of that. I mean, you as Renée, but anyone as the visiting readers, let's call them.
Or percipients.
Or percipients, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's like a Lawrence Weiner. I associate that word with Lawrence Weiner.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they're forced into kind of finding out their way within these force fields.
Yes,
and creating their own as well.
Exactly. I'm not telling anyone what to do.
Yeah.
Just come into the house. Welcome, bon venone.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about this as well. I think this work kind of has such a different dimension in this particular position. Because when you place it in an institution, it has this kind of specific tone to the welcoming. And when you put it in a house just by the door, it's like completely changed into something which is almost like, and that's, I don't mean to say that in a disrespectful way, but it's almost like a doormat. Like a doormat. You know, yeah. You say like, welcome, you know, to this beautiful house, our family welcomes you. So there's this kind of specific quality to it where you just like walk in and you really feel welcome.
That's really nice. I like that because you have seen it. You've seen an iteration of the Bon Venone banners. Like I had several of them even. And a screen with it on in the museum in Cleveland, in the Museum of Contemporary Art there. So it was a real hardcore attempt to welcome within a very unwelcoming environment, I have to say. Something that looked like a spaceship.
Exactly.
And so,
data process.
Yeah, like a pyramid, a reflective pyramid. And so now in the house, when you enter, as soon as you cross the threshold, you can see it, and it's very large. It'd be a very large wall mat.
Yeah, but I think there's a sense of like when you look at that in Cleveland, for instance, and you have this like big glass building, which is really unwelcoming, and then you walk in the threshold and you see a banner welcoming you. It's a way of actually asking people to please feel welcomed, right? I think. And whereas here, it's almost like, welcome, now the ball's with you, you know, like you're free to roam, this is your house, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, so maybe that's part of this kind of domestic, you know, what you were saying about, because that's, the house itself has, I mean, a particular quality. And so that's part of what I wanted to locate in terms of what I can do in the house or with the house and create the kind of situation in it. And so that's been something that has been really enjoyable, like to be in this particular house, feeling the house, moving around, and figuring out all of the locations and where things can be exactly. So, yeah. And living, literally living with the exhibition, yeah. So that's been very enjoyable because I can experience the light throughout the day and just see it all day long, and so that's a part of the show, changing all the light, removing the fixtures, having to be something that's dependent on the daylight. So yeah, I mean, there's electricity in the show too. There are film projections, but still, it's been like a kind of directing the house situation, which has been really, I really liked that.
It's a whole new kind of terrain to some degree, thinking about like how much we've spoken about living as part of your practice. Considering living with the things, living with the work. I guess takes on like another density. And I'm also thinking about an expression you have used before, which is in living memory. And
within living memory.
Within living memory,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And
I was asked about that by our friend Lara.
Yeah.
She wanted to know what was I talking about. What did it mean? What does it mean within living memory?
Can you?
Did you have an idea what that means?
Well, I do have ideas of what it could mean. And
okay.
I think for me, it really has this sense of continuity again, ongoingness, and like these. When I look at the things we were looking at here, the lists of years and the lists of names. For me, it's about like how these connections, as tenuous as they can be, carry things into each other, and that's kind of within living memory. That's the flow of information, of culture, of knowledge, of life experience from these overlaps.
Yeah. I mean, I that's related to what I was thinking about when I was using that term. I mean, it's a term also, though, that's been used to talk about what. Yeah, it really like a relay, as you describe. It's something that would be within the span of any living beings that something could be remembered. And so, say through like 100 years, if there's some very old person who's able to remember like something within the span of their living memory, things are contained. And so it's like a library, that's an expression too about like a person being like a library, what they can remember within their lifespan. But it's about, it refers to the idea that things could be remembered and passed on, and that it's within a span of anyone, that there's still someone alive who can remember something about something that happened. So that connects also very much to like oral history and telling people, relaying what happened about something. And that's I liked using it in terms of the different, like a space, a physical space. Like I made a print called Within Living Memory, and it relates actually to this series of prints that are here. But I wanted to place it at Harvard, for example, to think about that location. What do we remember?
This kind of transmission.
The transmission, and then I mean, what was mentioned about like these various characters or whatever, like within the selected life indexes, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois. I mean, I always remember about different specific people who passed through a place. Muriel Rukeyser passed through MIT. They're different. Berenice Abbott, the photographer, was a friend of Muriel Rukeyser's. Muriel Rukeyser's eye is like captured in a Berenice Abbott experimental photograph that has a circle that goes around with her eye, like repeated, like that you can turn around. That's her eye. So there are like these weird details that I think about when I pass through like different places like that. And so now the house is another one. You know, we can think of like what's the association, you know, with the materials, with the structure, with the garden, and then having the kind of overlay. I think of like my work in a way coming into it as an overlayer or an interweaving with what's here, what's already here, and that's part of what I'd like to have a resonance, this kind of combination between things. So yeah.
Yeah, I think this print also kind of relates to this idea of living memory in a nice way for me, like this kind of
William Morris.
Yeah,
That's the title.
which is another like interesting character within this pantheon, let's say. But yeah, like this idea of layering demands and layering desires and layering memory and layering strife across like the range of humanity. So to some degree, we're always within living memory of something, absolutely, even though these things don't share the same name.
Right, we're within living memory of a tree.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bodies of water.
For sure.
Those traces. Rocks.
Well, speaking of rocks, actually,
Yeah.
and this might be my last question.
Okay.
I'm curious about the work that I find the most difficult for me to place within the set that composes this exhibition.
Okay.
Which is slow walking in Lisbon.
Ah, okay.
And you're talking about rocks, and then you have the Portuguese like, pavement, which is a very like, for us, carries a lot of like particular meanings here.
Mm-hmm. It has a lot of meaning for me too. Walking that pavement. I made different works actually in the early 1990s that had to do. I was living there for a short time, but I was researching maps actually, and histories, geographies, but I was walking there, and I've made over time different videos that had to do with walking in Lisbon. They're called Walking in Lisbon, and it was very intentional. The title, one was made in 1992, another one was made in 2000. And I wanted to think about what within living memory could I see were changes that took place also in terms of perception, even perception of my body moving through that city. And so and what was that? I didn't understand it when I was there. I didn't understand what any of the perceptions were, really. And so I was using my body to test being there, and I was making a trace. It's like an indexical trace, very literal, of the street and my steps. And then I slowed them down and focused just on the walking. And so I have some of the videos are moving through. There's another person who's shooting me as the character moving through all over the city in Lisbon. And so one in 1992 and then another one in 2000. And so then you also see the locations, the people, the streets, all of those kinds of things. And then I made another one in 2016 that's called Walking in Nile, N-Y-L, and it's like combining New York and Lisbon together, and in a fictional movement through space. So, so anyway, I wanted to have this slow walking it was like a personal connection to one of the moments of being engaged with like the whole history and thinking about language in Portuguese and Portugal, Ceuta, the continent of Africa. That was what my work when I was there was working on, tracing where the Portuguese had gone in Africa, the first location that they had arrived to in Ceuta by boat. So yeah, it's just a kind of like I wanted to have, as you mentioned before, like there are like these different decades of being involved in some way with thinking about Brazil. I was thinking about Brazil then as well. So yeah.
Yeah, and now that you mention it, like the shots of you as a character walking in the city, they appear in Begin Again as well.
Right.
Sorry, in Come Closer.
In Come Closer, yeah. So Come Closer is actually kind of ties a lot of things.
Yeah.
So that's from 2008,
yeah.
and it ties a lot of those things together in that.
Yeah, it's really nice to think about these two works in conjunction in that way, in that we're seeing you walking at this particular geography from one angle, and then we come down the stairs and we see it in another
It's
angle.
like my perspective,
exactly,
because I'm shooting the walking.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of that in the exhibition, like these points of relation between the works as well that are kind of dependent on digging into each particular thing and finding the references, and just being constantly reminded of the relation within relation.
I hope it's enjoyable.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I can definitely say that it is.